You know this earthling, this person? The Scottish play by William Shakespeare is the origin of phrases such as one fell swoop, the be-all and the end-all, a sorry sight, what's done is done, there's no such thing, screw your courage to the sticking place,
screw your courage to the sticking place,
the milk of human kindness,
the milk of human kindness,
stars hide your fires,
stars hide your fires,
the crack of doom. And also words like champion as a verb, drugged, impede, and unreal. And also it popularized the phrase come what may with Mackers' line, come what come may. And it's where John Williams got all the lyrics to the Frog Choir song in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. But what I want to begin with in this video is that the Scottish play is the origin of knock-knock jokes.
Spook!
There's a scene in the play where Macduff is knocking on the door of Mackers' castle, and there's a servant character called the porter whose job it is to unlock the door and let Macduff in. Now you may know porter as a term describing someone who carries your luggage because porter comes from the Latin word portare, meaning to carry, but in this case, porter comes from the Latin word porta, which means door. And this porter in Mackers' castle is hungover, and he's kinda crazy, and when Macduff knocks on the door, he fantasizes about being the gatekeeper of hell. If a man were porter of Hellgate, he says, he should have old turning the key. In other words, if a man were the gatekeeper of hell, he would have to open the door for so many sinners that turning the key to unlock it would be an old habit. And while Macduff keeps knocking on the door, waiting to be let in, the porter does a little role play with himself, and he pretends that he's welcoming a parade of sinners into hell. And for each imaginary sinner that he lets in, he tells a proto-knock-knock joke to describe and mock the sinner. And for the second of these sinners, the porter says, knock knock, who's there in the other devil's name? Faith here's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Oh, come in, equivocator. Believe it or not, and this blew my mind when I found out, this is almost certainly a reference to the Gunpowder plot of 1605. You know.
Remember the 5th of November.
That Gunpowder plot. The one with Guy Fawkes. Because Guy Fawkes and William Shakespeare were contemporaries. They lived at the same time in history. And the Gunpowder plot was a rebellion at best and an act of terrorism at worst against King James I, who was also the patron of Shakespeare's acting company, the King's Men. So the Scottish play is full of things that legitimize him as king. For one thing, King James I was obsessed with persecuting witches. He even wrote a book about witchcraft called Demonology. The dude was a dork. And so in the play, surprise surprise, the dark deeds of the Scotsmen are set in motion by 3 witches. Also, when the wife of King James, Anne of Denmark, was sailing from Denmark to meet her husband for the first time, her ship was forced by terrible storms at sea to stop at Norway. And so James personally sailed out to Norway to pick her up. And after that, incidentally, they stopped by Denmark, stayed in Elsinore Castle, as in from Hamlet, and they met with astronomer Tycho Brahe. Fun facts. But King James I blamed the storms on witchcraft. And so in the Scottish play, Shakespeare gives his witches the power to conjure up storms. There's a scene where one of the witches describes a time when she conjured up a tempest to shipwreck the husband of a woman who insulted her.
Her husband's to Aleppo gone, master of a tiger, but in a sieve I'll thither sail, and like a rat without a tail, I'll do, and I'll do. Weary Senites, 9 times 9 shall he dwindle, peak and pine. Though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest tossed.
And according to Edward Allen Loomis, writing for Shakespeare Quarterly in 1956, there was an actual ship called the Tiger that made a voyage to Aleppo in 1583.
And what is Aleppo?
I'm glad you asked, Gary Johnson. Aleppo is the capital of Syria, and during the Jacobean Age, that is, the reign of James, it was a bustling port of trade. And a ship called the Tiger, possibly the same ship, made a voyage in 1605 when it was attacked by pirates. The ship finally made it back to England in 1606, 6 weeks before the first performance of the Scottish play for King James I, according to the research of Edward Allen Loomis. So the terrible voyage of the Tiger would have been the talk of London at the time, and so Shakespeare puts it in his play as the victim of a witch's mischief, because this play is for James I, who has a lot of history with witches and sea storms. And if that wasn't enough evidence to convince you that Shakespeare was making a reference to the real ship the Tiger, when the Tiger in real life was on the voyage where it was attacked by pirates, it was at sea for precisely 567 days. And in the Scottish play, the witch says that the ship will be cursed with stormy seas for weary se'nights 9 times 9. Se'night is short for 7 night, aka a week, and so 9 weeks times 9 is 567 days. Also, one of the subplots in the Scottish play is that Macker's friend Banquo is prophesied to be the father of a line of kings from whom King James I is descended. Because Banquo wasn't invented by Shakespeare, he was a figure of Scottish legend. He was said to be the Thane of Lochaber, and a Thane is a Scottish lord who is granted his title by the king, as opposed to a regular lord who inherits his title. Banquo's son is named Fleance, and in the play, Fleance survives the assassination of his father, and so he's free to grow up and become the ancestor of King James I. So Shakespeare portraying Banquo as a good guy is flattering to King James, who again was believed to be descended from Fleance. But here's the thing though, Shakespeare was wrong. They were all wrong. James I was not descended from Banquo or Fleance. So first of all, how did Shakespeare make the connection between James and Fleance? Alright now, buckle up. Shakespeare got his information from a chronicler named Raphael Holinshed. According to Holinshed, this is what the family tree looked like for characters in the Scottish play. We start with King Malcolm II. Malcolm II has 2 daughters, Bethoch and Donata. Bethoch had a son named Duncan, and Donata had a son named Macbeth. Duncan married Suthen, and she was related to Siward, and his son Osbeorn, aka young Siward in the play. Duncan and Suthen were the parents of Malcolm and Donalbain. And then we've got this guy named Gil. Gil was the ruler of a smaller northern kingdom. Gil's wife was Gruach. They had a son named Lulach. Gil died when he was burned alive along with 50 of his men. The person responsible was probably either Malcolm II or Mackers. Historians don't know for sure. But after Gil's death, Mackers married Gruach, and Lulach became Macker's stepson. And then over here we got Banquo, and Banquo's son is Fleance. So these are the characters in the Scottish play. You have Mackers, Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain, Siward, young Siward, Lady M, Banquo, and Fleance. Okay, so in the play, Mackers kills Duncan and becomes king. Then Siward leads an invasion of Scotland, resulting in the death of young Siward, and eventually Mackers. In the play, after the defeat of Mackers, Malcolm becomes king immediately, but in real life, Lulach becomes the next king, and so Malcolm has to defeat and kill him too. And then Malcolm becomes King Malcolm III. Malcolm had 11 children, but we're only going to talk about 6 of them here. There was Duncan, via Malcolm's first wife, Ingebjorg, and then Edward, Edmund, Edgar, Alexander, and David, via his second wife, Margaret. Malcolm named Edward his heir, but then both of them died in battle one day. And then, plot twist, Donalbain takes advantage of the chaos and usurps the throne, crowning himself King Donald III, and he banishes all of his nephews to England. The nephews return with a vengeance, and they overthrow him, and so Duncan becomes King Duncan II. But Duncan's half-brother Edmund betrays him to Donalbain, and so he's ambushed and killed, and Donalbain is back to being king. And so the remaining loyal brothers, Edgar, Alex, and David, team up to overthrow Donalbain again, and they throw him in prison and mutilate him, and there he dies. And then they ship Edmund off to become a monk. This leaves Edgar to be king. He dies of old age with no heirs. So Alexander becomes King Alexander I. He dies with no legitimate heirs, and so David becomes King David I. Meanwhile, Fleance has a son named Walter. and I'm going to call this Walter Walter Prime, because he's the first Walter in this family line. Walter Prime was appointed by King David to manage the affairs of the royal household as its steward, so he became the first Lord High Steward of Scotland. Walter Prime had a son named Alan Fitzwalter, and Fitz means son of, so Alan Fitzwalter means Alan, son of Walter. Alan Fitzwalter becomes the next Lord High Steward of Scotland. Alan Fitzwalter had a son named Walter, who took Stewart as his last name because he was the High Steward. Walter Stewart had a son named Alexander Stewart. Alexander Stewart had a son named James Stewart. James Stewart had a son named Walter Stewart. Meanwhile, King David I has a son known as Henry of Scotland. Henry has 3 sons, Malcolm, William, and David. Henry died first, and then King David, and so Malcolm IV became the next king, but he died young with no heirs, and so his brother, William the Lion, became the next king. William the Lion was the father of King Alexander II. Alexander II was the father of King Alexander III. Alexander III was the father of Margaret of Scotland. Margaret of Scotland married King Eric II of Norway, and so she became the Queen of Norway. We stand a queen, but she died giving birth to her daughter, Margaret, Maid of Norway. When Margaret, Maid of Norway, was still a small child, King Alexander died. Margaret, Maid of Norway, was his heir presumptive, but she was never crowned because she died of illness on the voyage to Scotland. So who would rule Scotland now? Well, I am just splattering ink everywhere now. David over here had 2 daughters, Margaret of Huntingdon and Isabel of Huntingdon. Margaret of Huntingdon was the mother of Dervorgilla of Galloway. Dervorgilla of Galloway was the mother of John Balliol. John Balliol had the support of Edward Longshanks, the scheming king of England, who helped him rise to the throne as a puppet ruler who turned Scotland into a vassal of England. Oh no! But Isabel of Huntingdon married Robert IV de Bruce, and their son was Robert V de Bruce, and his son was Robert VI de Bruce, and his son was Robert the Bruce, who, with the help of William Wallace, defeated the English in the First War for Scottish independence and became Scotland's next king. King Robert the Bruce was the father of Marjorie Bruce, and Marjorie Bruce married Walter Stewart. Walter and Marjorie had a son, and they named him Robert after his heroic grandfather, Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce didn't have any male heirs, and so his younger brother, Edward Bruce, was to succeed him as king, but then Edward Bruce died in battle, and so baby Robert became the new heir. But then Robert the Bruce had a son named David. David II had no children, and so when he died, finally, Robert became King Robert II. King Robert II was the father of King Robert III. Robert III was the father of King James I. But it's not the same King James. It's not the same person. Shakespeare's King James I was King James I of England. This was King James I of Scotland. Just bear with me. James I of Scotland was the father of King James II of Scotland, and Scotland is only spelled with 1 T. Fun fact. King James II of Scotland was the father of King James III of Scotland. King James III of Scotland was the father of King James IV, who commissioned an historian named Hector Boyce to chronicle his royal lineage. Remember that for later. James IV also married Margaret Tudor, who is the daughter of King Henry VII of England, whom you may remember is a character in the Shakespeare play Richard III. James IV and Queen Margaret were the parents of King James V, who, because of his dual royal parentage, had the royal blood of both Scotland and England in his veins. Oh, look at that contouring. And those eyebrows, my goodness. And King James V was the father of Mary, Queen of Scots. Meanwhile, King Henry VII was the father of King Henry VIII, who was the father of Queen Elizabeth I, the original patron of Shakespeare. The life of Mary, Queen of Scots is far too interesting and complex for this vlog, but to grossly oversimplify it, there was an uprising that forced her to abdicate, leaving the throne for her baby son, King James VI. And her dual royal pedigree and claim to the English throne made her a rival of Elizabeth I. So when she fled to England after she abdicated, Elizabeth I imprisoned her, and then Mary tried to conspire to assassinate Elizabeth, so Elizabeth had her executed. Scotland was ruled by regents until King James VI grew up, and then Queen Elizabeth died without any children, and so King James VI became the heir to the English throne. And so the crowns of England and Scotland were united, and James VI became James I of England. And James I of England continued Elizabeth I's tradition of supporting William Shakespeare. And so Shakespeare, who previously wrote a bunch of plays that flatter the royal lineage of Elizabeth I by portraying her ancestors in a positive light, now wrote the Scottish play, which flatters the royal lineage of King James I by portraying his family, the Stuart family, in a positive light all the way up to its progenitor, Banquo. And this royal lineage appears in the play as a vision that Mackers has when he meets the witches a second time. In the play, Mackers is haunted by a vision of Banquo's ghost walking behind a procession of 8 kings. And so those 8 phantom kings in the vision represent Robert II, Robert III, James I of Scotland, James II, James III, James IV, James V, skip her because sexism, and James I of England. And that is how Shakespeare connected Banquo to James I and portrayed that lineage in the Scottish play. But there's one problem. If you trace the lineage of James I from him all the way to Walter Prime, then so far we're good. That is all accurate as far as we know. But remember how Shakespeare got his information from Raphael Holinshed, who said that Walter Prime was the son of Fleance, the son of Banquo? This is where we go off the rails. Because Holinshed got the figures of Banquo and Fleance from the writings of Hector Boyce. Remember him? The guy commissioned by James IV to chronicle his royal lineage? Well, see, what happened is when James IV commissioned Boyce to chronicle his royal lineage, Boyce just made up a bunch of shit in order to portray the ancestors of James IV, you know, the guy giving him money, as heroes and good guys. Hector Boyce mixed fact and fiction in his historical chronicle. And so for all we know, Banquo and Fleance are fictional creations of Boyce, who just put them in the history as the ancestors of James IV in order to make James IV look good. Then Raphael Holinshed came along, and he was an historian who served Elizabeth I. So in his chronicle, he portrayed Banquo as the evil accomplice of Mackers in the murder of King Duncan. Because remember, Elizabeth I was the enemy of Mary Queen of Scots, and so in Elizabeth's history books, the ancestors of Mary Queen of Scots are not the heroes. And then Shakespeare came along to write the Scottish play, and he was being paid by James I, and so suddenly Banquo's back to being a good guy again. Because when the history is being funded by the monarch, the history is going to distort the facts to support that monarch. But the lies of one monarch's history are built upon the lies of another monarch's history, which are in turn built upon the lies of another monarch's history. Like it's just levels and levels of propaganda and flattery going all the way back through human civilization. Just like the expression, it's turtles all the way down. This is why it's so important to listen to and share the stories and the histories of people who aren't in power. So, if Fleance wasn't the real father of Walter Prime, then who was? Well, in the 1770s, there was a Scottish historian named David Dalrymple. Dalrymple was a nobleman, but he was only a baronet, the lowest rank of lord, and he wasn't funded by any monarchs. He had a reputation for unbiased historicity, and he was the first to definitively say that Walter Prime was not the son of Fleance. Dalrymple called the work of Boyce, Holinshed, and Shakespeare flattering and ignorant fictions as it pertains to Fleance and Banquo. And he was very bold in saying that we don't know what the real ancestry of Walter Prime is. And in my opinion, sometimes it takes a lot of integrity to admit that you don't know, especially when it would be so much more fun and or profitable to say that you do. It wasn't until the turn of the 19th century that a Scottish antiquarian named George Chalmers was able to determine that Walter Prime was the son of Alan Fitzflawd, the Sheriff of Shropshire in 12th century England. So now we know Walter Prime as Walter Fitzalan. And when Walter FitzAlan was appointed to be the first High Steward of Scotland, he moved from England to Scotland along with his family and vassals. And vassals are people who serve you under the feudal system. And one of the vassal families of Walter FitzAlan who migrated from England to Scotland along with him in the 11th century is the Montgomery family, which eventually grew into Clan Montgomery. And longtime viewers of this vlog will know that the Montgomerys are my ancestors.
My family is Scottish on both sides.
So, long story short, if Mackers had not been defeated and eventually succeeded by Malcolm as king, I would not be here making this vlog today. Okay, wait, where was I going with this? Oh, right, yes. The gunpowder plot. That's what this vlog is supposed to be about. I need something to help me get through the end of this vlog. I have shot all 3 episodes of this HarkVlogs miniseries back to back, and it is 4:30 in the morning right now. Okay, so anyway, the porter is telling knock-knock jokes about various sinners, and one of the sinners is an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. And this is a reference to the gunpowder plot, which was a Catholic plot against James I, because James I, like Elizabeth before him, was persecuting Catholics. So a bunch of Catholic rebels, led by a guy named Robert Catesby and aided by a gunpowder expert named James the First, and aided by a gunpowder expert named Guy Fawkes, tried to blow up the House of Lords and kill James I on November 5th, 1605. But the plot was discovered and thwarted thanks to a traitor in the rebels' ranks. To this day, the traitor's name has never been revealed. You might even say that the traitor was anonymous. It was possibly a guy named Francis Tresham, but we don't know for sure. But one of the books found in the possession of Francis Tresham was a Treatise of Equivocation by Jesuit priest Henry Garnet. Henry Garnet knew about the gunpowder plot, but he disapproved of it because he was against the use of violent force. On the other hand, he did keep the plot a secret, and he wrote a book called A Treatise of Equivocation, where he described a way to lie without really lying. For example, if you're hiding a Catholic priest in your house, and the Protestant inquisitors of King James I come knocking at your door asking, "Are you harboring a priest here?" you could say no, if you interpret here to mean this room. Like if you think in your head, "I'm hiding a priest here in this house, but I'm not hiding a priest here in this room," and the Inquisitor didn't specify which here he was referring to, so technically I'm not lying if I equivocate his use of the word here to here in this room, so no, I'm not hiding a priest here. And so this method of equivocation is how a lot of Catholics, including those who were on trial for the gunpowder plot, used vagueness as a way to avoid getting punished without feeling guilty that they were lying and breaking the 9th commandment. So William Shakespeare's over here, funded by King James I, who just survived the gunpowder plot, and he's writing the Scottish play. A play that King James will love. A play that supports King James's false notions of his legendary ancestor Banquo. A play that casts Banquo in a positive light and legitimizes the rule of James. A play that just feeds James's paranoia of witches and demons and the supernatural. And finally, a play that vindicates King James by telling him that his enemies are going to hell when the Porter character tells the second knock-knock joke in history about a poor equivocator who committed treason for God's sake, yet could not equivocate his way into heaven. Also important to note that this is the same King James that commissioned the King James Bible, which has way more uses of the word hell in it than any other Bible translation. But that's another vlog. So thanks for watching the third and final episode of my mini-series on the Scottish play. Obviously the original goal was to upload this on November 5th to coincide with Guy Fawkes night, but just like Guy Fawkes and the Scotsman both, my ambition was too high and difficult to achieve, because this is the longest normal HarkVlog I've ever done, and it took me weeks to edit. So Guy Fawkes night is past and we're approaching Thanksgiving. So in order to make this vlog seasonally relevant again, how about this? When the Gunpowder Plot was discovered, anti-Catholic sentiment rose in England, as evidenced by Guy Fawkes Night becoming a yearly event where people gather around bonfires to burn effigies of Guy Fawkes and the Pope, and a certain group of nonconformist Protestants were galvanized to purify the Church of England by purging it of its Catholic influence, and so this group was called the Puritans, and a smaller subset of the Puritans wanted to leave the Church of England altogether and practice their religion independently, but King James wasn't having it, and he made it illegal to not attend the Church of England, and so these separatist Puritans organized themselves around 1605, the same year as the Gunpowder Plot, and a couple years later moved to Holland so that they could practice their religion in peace. And so because they made this journey for religious reasons, they were called Pilgrims, and in 1620 they set sail aboard the Mayflower for the New World, where they established Plymouth Colony, and when they weren't killing native people and looting their burial mounds, the native people were helping them survive, and after the harvest, they celebrated Thanksgiving. Okay, so now the vlog is seasonally relevant again, and I can finally end this video. But wait, there's more! Out of all the passengers on the Mayflower, there was only one who had been to the New World before, and that was Stephen Hopkins. Previously, in 1609, Stephen Hopkins was on a voyage to Jamestown, you know, the town named after King James, aboard a ship called the Sea Venture along with future Jamestown governor Sir Thomas Gates. And terrible storms at sea shipwrecked the Sea Venture on Bermuda, the archipelago at the corner of the Bermuda Triangle. And they called Bermuda the Isle of Devils because at night the cries of the birds and wild pigs made the voyagers think that the island was haunted by demons. And there on the island, Stephen Hopkins challenged the authority of Sir Thomas Gates, who sentenced him to death for mutiny. But then Sir Thomas Gates pardoned Stephen because the other shipwrecked crew members on the island begged for Sir Thomas to relent. And when news of this shipwreck misadventure made it back to England, it is believed by some scholars to be what inspired William Shakespeare to write The Tempest, which is a comedy about an island where supernatural spirits live and where a sea storm, or a tempest, if you will, causes a ship to wreck on the island. And one of the shipwrecked characters in The Tempest is named Stefano, which is the Italian form of the name Stephen. And in the play, Stefano tries to scheme against the ruler of the island to take over as its new king. And so scholars believe that the character Stefano might be based on the mutinous Stephen Hopkins. But in real life, after Stephen was pardoned of mutiny, the crew of the Sea Venture built 2 new ships and they finished the voyage to Jamestown, and Stephen was with them. Sometime later, Stephen sailed back to England to look after his children, and that's when he was recruited by the Mayflower to join their voyage as an assistant to the governors of Plymouth to use his knowledge of the New World to guide them. And when Stephen made the voyage to Plymouth aboard the Mayflower, he took his family and his servants along with him. And one of his I promise you I'm not making this up, one of the servants indentured to Stephen Hopkins was a young man named Edward Doty, who is another one of my ancestors. I just found this out last night when I was researching more content to add to this vlog to make it more relevant to Thanksgiving, and it blew my mind. So that's it. I can finally end the vlog now. It's done. It's over.